When people talk about housing in Canada, it can certainly generate some anxiety. Between rising interest rates, increased demand, and a vulnerable supply chain, the housing market is under pressure. So, what can we do to improve access and affordability? Well, the answer may lie in the innovation and entrepreneurialism of a local real estate developer in Alberta. Hey there. Welcome back to another episode of C-Suite Unplugged. In this series, host Adam Legg talks to Alberta's top CEOs, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about their journey to the C-Suite, what keeps them up at night as an Albertan and as a leader in their industry, and what their outlook is for the future. And today we're joined by Rohit Gupta, the president of Rohit Group of Companies, a family-owned business that has spanned countries and continents since its founding. Rohit discusses his journey to the top job, the company's rich history, how innovative partnerships are helping shape the company's growth mindset, and how he is pushing the boundaries of a traditional sector. He also discusses addressing housing affordability in Canada, the challenges in the current housing market, and what he hopes to see from Alberta in the next decade, and his aspirations for his company over the next 20 years. If you liked this episode, please be sure to head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate the show, and give us a quick review. For now, enjoy this conversation with Rohit Gupta.
Welcome to another C-Suite Unplugged, an Alberta Better podcast. Today, we're joined by Rohit Gupta, president of the Rohit Group of Companies. I think you're really going to like hearing from Rohit. I'll start off by saying that he's quickly become one of my favorite people to spend time with. He's incredibly thoughtful, driven, and curious. And the more time I spend with Rohit, I come away amazed at the diversity of perspective and angles he brings to the work he does and the issues he contemplates. His background in computer engineering blended with the family business of real estate development means he's pushing boundaries of a very traditional sector. I think you'll enjoy hearing his story and his insights. He's also one of our CEO task force members for our Define the Decade project, and we're incredibly fortunate to have him at that table and within the council. So Rohit, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Adam.
Rohit, before we dig in, could you give us your elevator pitch as to who you are, your role, and the company?
Well, Adam, as president of the Rohit Group, really I'm the energizer bunny that tries to keep the engine going for the company. And what my role is to really try to figure out how to add more energizer bunnies. So we're a little bit of not a wolf pack, but a rabbit pack that's running around and creating value for the marketplace and value for ourselves as we continue to go forward. And a little bit about the company. We're a real estate development group, and we now go by our mission as being we're the real estate opportunity company. And we try to get in and try to figure out how to create value within real estate. We operate in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario, and we're hoping to enter into the US in short order. We build about 1,000 units a year currently, and we're trying to move that number of volume across Canada up. We build retail shopping centers, we're in the office space, and we're in the land development business across the country. We've got an incubator that we're going to try to bring to market here, trying the commercialization of a tech company called BuildBase. And so we're going to be trying to bring that out.
Very cool. And is that a real estate tech focused company?
You know, it's a home building focused tech company, but I like to call it that we've codified our IP of our home building business, and we're hopefully going to be able to democratize it and release it to the home building market, hopefully give our IP away.
Well, that's fantastic. Make the industry more advanced and more innovative. That's awesome. Good for you and trying to break through a very traditional sector. Rohit, you've lived all over the world. I wonder if you could maybe just give us a brief snapshot of your upbringing and where you've lived and how that might have shaped who you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So I was born in Edmonton in '79. Family moved to Libya, Tripoli, Libya, as my dad got a job with Occidental, and we were in Libya from '82 to '89. And over that period, got a really interesting upbringing because every 6 months we were either in India or we were in Canada visiting family. And every now and then we'd be in Europe traveling around. And then as a family, we became born again immigrants, I like to say. We moved back to Edmonton in '89 just for the cup run. And my sister was cheering for the Oilers. So I had to cheer for the Boston Bruins, as any good brother would. And over that period, it's been an interesting journey from a family perspective because I spent so much time in India and so much time in an Arab country and then so much time in Canada over that life cycle. I've had the opportunity to live in lots of different locations. At one time, I was trying to see if I could move out to Europe myself personally. So lots of different exposures for that period.
Yeah, it's quite a variety of places you've lived and must have shaped lots of different insights as you go through life. Now you lead a family business, but I'd be curious, what was Rohit fresh out of high school thinking in terms of what he was going to do, where he was going to go, and what his career was going to look like? What was your path to where you are now today?
Yeah, so that's an interesting journey. To kind of give context, I started with the intention of going into computing sciences, then into engineering physics at Queen's, then back to computer engineering at the University of Alberta. By the time I graduated, I started taking open studies in philosophy, and was trying to see if I could get into a nuclear physics program potentially somewhere in the country. So it's a very much a academic / research driven entity approach. With this pragmatic component that I still needed to pay the bills. And so I needed a job. So it made sense to be an engineer more than it did to be a scientist for some, whatever. I'm not trying to be derogatory, but that was kind of the logic center. And I stumbled into the family business because A, I was the namesake, and B, I was still between my bachelor's program trying to figure out which master's program I would go into, and my parents needed some help. Frankly, I missed the master's program journey because I was busy partying a lot and enjoying life and not being focused. Working with my father and my mother really helped bring that focus in, especially in a company that had 16 people at the time when I joined it. And now we're roughly a complement of 200 people today. And over that 20-year period, trying to figure out how do you operate a business that was in hyper growth mode. So I would have joined in 2002, and that's just really when the boom was taking off here in Alberta. So we neither had the infrastructure or anything of that nature at that time. But the journey through university was really one about trying to find new ways to create value, partying a lot, and at the same time running some side hustles here and there to try to figure out how you can monetize any situation you could, whether it's throwing a great bash or trying to figure out how to start a computer networking company. I do remember fondly that one of my friends and I were looking at neural networks, and we're trying to figure out how we could use gambling, how we could use it to help us on sports betting in terms of using where teams had drafted players, and looking at injuries and the average age of players and salaries, and see if we could forecast which football team to bet on at one time. Horrible failure, but that was kind of the pet project we were going one semester.
Not quite the Moneyball outcome on that. Well, it sounds like you're in good company with some of the strong entrepreneurs who, deep into school, like to party and then also create some value along different companies. So you're part of the greats out there, I think, for sure. How has your engineering and science background changed the way perhaps Rohit Group of Companies does business compared to your parents or other conventional real estate and home building companies?
Yeah, so I would say majority of the home building, we started in the home building business and we expanded into all these other opportunities as a real estate group. So I'll start from a home building business, but most of our peer set that we have, and when I joined the business, were people that had a extremely strong construction background or in the trades, a really good background in the sales cycle, or came out of the finance side of the business, but very, very few people came out of the engineering / project management center. And specifically in my domain, computer engineering, you tend to look at black box situations. You've got an input and you've got an output, and your output has to match the input requirements of the next party downstream. So we took a very engineering approach to our business, and trying to, in terms of process management and even some of the aspects of the business where we put a lot of emphasis, whether it was in procurement or whether it was in the design side, in terms of trying to remove waste out of the design. And I'm not saying we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but that was the focus of the business, and that still tends to be the focus of the business. Now, the great part is, as we've matured as an organization, we've tried to bring in specialists within the construction space, specialists within the finance space, and specialists within the sales space to help augment some of the weaknesses we would have had in the genesis of the corporation or in the early stages. But that's what I would say is the engineering mindset and the planning mindset or urban planning mindset that we have as an organization is really what the driver of the growth has been. And then we've had the luxury of having some really great minds on the finance side from a business perspective that have been able to help us financially engineer good and positive outcomes for our business.
That's fantastic. Rohit, how would you describe your leadership philosophy?
I don't know if it's a leadership philosophy as much as it's a way of being. My belief is that every interaction we have with individuals should add value both to the counterparty and to ourselves as individuals. And so one of the things I try to encourage people to do is try to understand how they can help a counterparty. In Canada, we're really, really blessed that there's more food on the table than there are people. And so the best way to move forward is to try to figure out how you can accrete value to the other person. In an environment where you have less food on the table and more people, the only way to get ahead is to make sure the other person beside you doesn't eat. So it's a very different way and a very different issue that paradigm we in North America and specifically in the Western world have a benefit of building our businesses around, or being in the community. And so I always try to get people to think about how can they help the counterparty and hopefully not just take from the counterparty in a conversation. I generally find one of the things I'm trying to really look for in our organization, whether it's on exit interviews or on onboarding process, is individuals to say, you know what, all things, whether we like the organization, whether we don't like the organization, they consistently hopefully come back with, it's amazing how helpful this organization is. Mm-hmm. Right. And that really sets up the groundwork for being a positive experience for the overall community and the team.
Yeah, that's a unique way of looking at things, and always, as you say, hoping someone comes back to do business. What's a day in the life of Rohit Gupta look like? Any key routines or practices?
Yeah, I would say my alarm goes off at 4:45 in the morning at the latest, and try to be up earlier than that. So,
really?
So I'm midday as we're chatting right now. I'm more than midday. I'm at the end of the day. Exactly. But yeah, try to wake up 4:45, and it gives me an opportunity to work out and sometimes go for a morning bike ride or a morning walk before the sun's coming up in fall or spring. But during the summer, just really enjoy that early morning dew. And it really, the rest of the family really gets going around 7:00. So it gives me a lot of time to myself where I work out with a trainer. I try to have breakfast every day. That's just something I've been really committed to for a long, long time. And then get into the office by 8:30. And I'm trying to be home by 5:36. That wasn't the case before I had a kid, but I'm trying to be home by 5:36, and that's my blackout time till about 8:30. And then back to either work or hanging out with friends in the evening or something of that nature. But trying to leave as much of the work at work now. That wasn't the case early in my career. I would still wake up at 5 in the morning, and sometimes I'd be at my desk by 5:30, 6 in the morning, pushing paper out and pushing aggressively. But that's what you have to do when it's a high growth company. You got to be all hands on deck and pushing as hard as you can. But my view in life is, if you want to be having upward mobility and you want to be moving fast, you're on 7 days a week. So it's not necessarily, this is absolutely my time for work and this is my absolute time for my family. I tend to weave in and out of that on a constant basis. And I try to make sure there's 3 or 4 people in my life constantly at work I touch base with every day, 15 minutes to an hour a day, just to make sure the engine keeps moving in the right direction. So there's always 3 or 4 people in my life at any moment that I'm chasing that way.
Yeah, I have a friend who, instead of calling it work-life balance, he calls it work-life integration, that he finds a way to make sure that there's nothing is taking too much of one percentage or the other, that he knows, just given it, he's like you, he's an entrepreneur, runs a company, and just that's the nature of the way life is as an entrepreneur. So yeah, it's about creating those zones of time that create some integration between the two. Rohit, if someone were to come to you, high school student, say, ask your advice, what would you advise someone who's either just starting their post-secondary education or starting a career or wanting to start a business? What would you encourage them to do, or even potentially not to do?
Yeah, I would think the one thing I always come back to is, how are you adding value to the conversation, to the counterparty? Okay, you have to be running that constantly. I remember early in my career, unfortunately, I dealt with depression, severe depression, and I was trying to figure out how to add value to somebody, or if I met Adam on the streets, how would I add value to him? And I just had a simple goal. I made one person laugh every day. And that was value to the counterparty, because it brought joy in their life, and it gave me a reason to work hard and make it an incremental step. But you really work on incremental steps on how to learn how to win. And so if you start practicing, whether it's with your mom or with your wife, or whether your spouse or somebody at work, and you're just figuring out how to add value to them in the conversation. And it can be just as simple as, how can I help you? What can I do to make your life better? Or what can I do to help you achieve the objective that you have outstanding? Yeah. And that creates so many opportunities where people will say, hey, can you help me do this? Or can you help me X, Y, Z? These are the problems I have. And you may not be able to help with X and Y, but you can help with Z. And so just it's creating that sales call or call to action type of situation. So it's, again, adding value to somebody in every conversation you're with, other than just talking about the weather, is the most useful thing I think people can do.
Yeah, so many times we're focused on extracting maximum benefit for ourselves in a two-party relationship or transaction, particularly in a business transaction, but focusing on the other is a tremendous way to create that win-win. Rohit, let's shift to the company. Very much a family-run business started by your dad in the mid-'80s. Our understanding of that, and the family aspect is something integrated into the business and your life. So I wonder if you could maybe just give us a snapshot of the history of the company, and then where are you taking it, other than adding the tech component? What's your vision of how you're building your legacy, your version of the company, and your portion of your chapter, president of the Rohit Group of Companies?
So earlier in the conversation, I indicated that we were in Africa in Libya from 82 to 89. Well, my father started the business in 86. And so how you do that is you have a lot of cash that you're developing out in Libya at the time. But at the same time, the workload wasn't full. So he spent half his time trying to call back into Canada, back specifically into Edmonton, and buying apartment buildings in 86, just right after the downturn that had hit. When we moved back in 89, we partnered with Greg Christensen from Christensen Developments, a fantastic individual, a fantastic group that's added tremendous value to society. And he gave us our first opportunity, Greg did, and to get into the development business, we got in there. And then subsequently, we started buying office buildings. And when the boom started to take place in 95, 96, we started getting some, not boom, but the oil started coming back. We had co-sign that ended up taking up one of our buildings. Mike Asher from Suncor was giving a speech one time in 97, and he encouraged my father out of that to come into Fort Mac and start developing up there. So that was our entry into Fort Mac. And we also bought raw land right around there. Mayor Bill Smith at the time in the city of Edmonton gave us a lot of support and helped us get that catalyzed. And so that was really the genesis where we started growing. And at one time, Fort McMurray was 50% of our business. And a lot of people don't know this, but we've built out about 7% of the housing stock in the city of Fort McMurray. And unfortunately, in 2015, and there's a lot of ins and outs. We went to Kelowna for a bit, came back out with our tail between our legs and stuff like that, beat up after the financial crisis. But in 2015, when the oil downturn started, that's when we started making the decision to rotate our capital out of northern Alberta specifically. And that's when we entered into Calgary and Regina. We just recently opened Saskatoon and Ottawa as offices for ourselves in the last year. And really between 2007, 2014 is where we started really building our land bank also, that has created the opportunity for us to get into the retail business. So that's been kind of the journey. And one of the things that my father has been, and my mother specifically too, have been really ardent supporters of is when downturns hit, we're not allowed to sit back on our laurels. We have to keep pushing through. So we created a restructuring group that's internal to our team, like internal to the executive. So when in 96, the market was down, and when in 2008, when the market was down, and when in 2014, when the market was down, each time we've gone in and bought assets that have been distressed from either lenders or so forth, and tried to do workouts and turnarounds. And even again, during COVID, 2020 hit, we picked up one or two assets that were distressed, and we're working on cleaning those assets up and turning those assets around. So our philosophy has been, whether in a recessionary period, whether in a boom cycle, we have to keep growing through it. And we're not allowed to be victims of a market. We have to be champions of our own destiny. And so we've been trying to continuously position ourselves. Now, my stamp, I would say, or the direction that's shifted in the firm, if anything, is we were largely a home builder and would spot opportunities that were taking place in office or retail. I believed for the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of the fundamentals of the marketplace are changing, specifically with all the different financing products that have come out from the federal government via CMHC, or looking at how ESG has rolled out across the market, where there's some partnerships required with a lot of not-for-profits or different specialty groups within the marketplace, that a pure market play has a limited growth trajectory across Alberta or across Canada. So we as a business have to now start creating partnerships with government and trying to understand how to partner with other not-for-profit agencies or other specialty groups and try to see if we can create some level of partnership. And that eventually ended up leading us to creating a partnership with Covenant Health, which we're trying to parlay ourselves into the healthcare business and more into the infrastructure side of domains. So that's one of the major changes that we've been starting to make in the real estate space over the last years.
Are you able to share us a little more about the Covenant Health project? It's really interesting that you shared that with me before.
Yeah, I really have to, before I jump into the details, but I really have to commend what the provincial government has done and the support that Covenant has shown us through the journey on this one. And there's a lot of risks that Covenant Health took with us as an organization to bring this idea to fruition. But we truly do believe we've created a prototype that could potentially create a new way of laying infrastructure across the country. The traditional P3 project space that has existed is the institution defines the needs and they hire a general contractor or a contracting company to come in and put capital into the deal and help them financially engineer the asset so that it's a beneficial asset specific to that asset, whether it's a road, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a school or so forth. But one of the things that's missed is all these assets that governments create, whether they're libraries, hospitals, schools, whatever, are all catalysts, economic catalysts. And so if you think about it in the context of Disneyland, Disney made the error of just owning the Disney resort. But when they went to Disney World, they decided to buy 25,000 acres and build a great big resort. They own the housing, they own the retail, they own the hotels and so forth, and they can create these integrated communities. And so that's the kind of concept that we're working with Covenant Health, is to try to figure out how can we not just own the hospital, Covenant, but how can we help you own the income streams off the senior care facility, the residential rentals, the retail, the office, all those other aspects of it. So you reduce your reliance, not just only on the CapEx side, but you also reduce your reliance on the OpEx from the government, and you become a self-sustaining entity. So that was point number one that we were trying to address. But then the second point that we're trying to, that the journey has moved over to, is we've been trying to segregate what are the high value add functions that hospitals like the Grey Nuns provide, and what are the low value add functions that we call some of the space that's occupying these hospitals. So a perfect example is hospitals are built to surgical standards right across, but a mental health ward would have a different standard. And so how do we segregate those standards and build appropriate to those standards? And so that's been a huge part of the journey, and it's fun, but I learned a ton about hospitals.
Yeah, it's sort of a niche area that probably wouldn't know much about it unless you had to really dig into it. Well, let's move from hospitals back to housing, and let's talk about the market overall. Maybe zooming out, taking a 30,000-foot view on the state of the home building sector. What's your take? What's happening in Canada's residential real estate market right now? I know you operate a few different markets. Maybe you can tease out some of the differences between where you're doing business, highlighting what's opportunistic, what's good. What are the opportunities and potential, and also then conversely, what's the challenge?
Well, as I like to say, sometimes COVID kind of ended on March 1st here in Alberta, when we were allowed to go out and start partying and socializing it. That's my joke, but a lot of good things are happening across Canada, but a lot of bad things are happening at the same time. And it's like any of the supply chain issues that like any of the manufacturers that are in the economy have been feeling. We're still seeing a lot of supply chain issues, and some of us are getting really tired of hearing those two words together. We still continue to see that. And those supply chain issues, or the whipsawing that we're seeing through that, is still causing us as builders to price to peak cost instead of what is the average cost on building a house. And so as a result, I personally believe there's a lot of inefficiencies that are being passed on to the consumer of housing, and housing prices have been high. And is there a potential for a reprieve once the stability comes into the marketplace? Yes. However, there's a countervailing pressure that exists in the marketplace, which is there's about 433,000 immigrants that the federal government is looking to give a green light and cause immigration through. And right now, based on a household formation basis, our estimate is that the market would need to add about 270 to 320,000 homes a year nationally to be able to support that many immigrants coming in. Going into COVID, the capacity in the marketplace was roughly around 225 to 250,000 homes a year is what the market capacity has been designed to. So somewhere between that high of 250, that capacity that increased, and the low of 270, I think that's the best case scenario we can hope for, is the delta we have to cover. But the worst case is that 225 to 320 homes, 320,000 homes is the delta that we have to cover from a labor force perspective and a supply side perspective that has to be backfilled. And so our personal belief is on today's basis nationally, there's a lot of upward pressure or a lot of underbuilding that will be potentially taking place over the next 2 or 3 years that would put upward pressure. And that's one side of the story. That's the supply and demand economic side of the story. The other side is that we're in a rising interest rate environment where the borrow and housing prices have been going rapidly, both in Ontario and BC. In some situations, some municipalities at 20 or 30% a year clip for the last couple of years. And so the rising interest rate environment is going to put a lot of pressure on some of those communities on whether the home buyer can afford to absorb the existing prices. So personally, and from a corporate perspective, we believe that the high price markets are going to start seeing a lot of pressure and a lot of dislocation, where people will start looking for different communities, whether they'll move further out from the city to get 2 hours worth of drive aisle back to work, or they start just looking at markets like Alberta, Saskatchewan, which are really, really affordable cities. I think there was a study that recently just came out that I heard about where Edmonton was ranked as the number 4 most affordable large city in the OECD.
Yeah.
And so you're in a situation where the government of Alberta is cash flow positive. The oil and gas companies are doing positive now. We have really affordable housing. And we actually have some of the most dynamic supply side housing markets where municipalities have been generally working with the developers and trying to figure out how to bring supply. So I believe there's going to be a lot of demand that's going to be taking place both in Alberta and Saskatchewan as we continue to move forward.
Yeah. It sounds like almost the perfect storm of squeeze on that'll drive prices up, whether it's supply chain issues, whether it's demand that's going to outstrip supply, rising interest rates, just, and even though you've talked a lot in our Define the Decade project about demographics as destiny and the opportunities in different real estate markets, particularly here in Alberta, vis-a-vis the comparison of prices in BC and Ontario, we can ride on that for a while, but at some point that also catches up. But just, you hear so much also from citizens and from governments about this drive for housing affordability or affordable housing. Do you see, is that going to be a nut that we'll be able to crack in Canada? And if so, how might we innovate or how might we do that given all of those complexities that, as you say, are really driving rising prices?
Yeah, so great question there, Adam. I would like to say that there's a silver bullet answer that I would have that I could share with you that would help satisfy or solve the issue. Lots smarter people have been working on it than I have. But I'd like to segregate the issue into 3 questions or 3 topics. There's the overt tax, that would be taxes that are administered by the city or a municipality or province that would exist there. There's the secondary tax that would be associated with supply side, demand side economics. Is supply outstripping demand or not to help affordability? But there's a third component, which is the hidden tax, which is the regulatory component that we tend to miss about. And so if we look at housing, and I'm going to talk anecdotally on a layman's perspective, but my father and I compare notes sometimes. He used to build houses in 3.5 months back in the early 80s with 2 or 3 inspections. And his lead cycle to get an approval was roughly less than a week from a development permit and building permit perspective. Today, in one of the municipalities we work in, the lead time for a development permit and building permit is about 6 weeks. Along with, we have 13 inspections which builds our minimum build cycle to about 6 months. On top of that, what we're dealing with is rising standards in terms of how much prescriptive regulatory framework that we're working in that drives that. And so instead of taking a performative approach that we want 82 EnerGuide rating on a house, we're saying, how do we go down a prescriptive path of reaching our net zero goals? So that's one bucket of hidden taxes I talk about. From a supply demand economics perspective, that's an issue of government as it gets bigger finds that, or any bureaucracy, whether it's government or not-for-profit or for-profit entities, as they become bigger, they want more rules. I look at our own organization as we've grown from 16 to 200 people. We have more rules in place to manage ourselves and constrain ourselves from going forward. Sometimes I wonder, would we be more effective if we just had less rules in our shop? And so I don't blame government for where they're at, but to help solve an error that a developer made or a builder made in a subdivision, apply a new rule to everybody else. And so there's an inherent problem where we will become more and more restrictive on supply as we continue to move forward and into the future. And we have to take a very activist role. If we want to introduce a rule, what rule are we taking off, or doing a total cost analysis, full cycle around that, which is a battle that always exists on every different industry and every different part of our daily lives. And then the third component is the tax levies and how are the taxation structures set up for whether it's each municipality or whether it is what the relationships between the municipality, provincial bodies, and the federal bodies. And those will really drive the costs. In all three scenarios, I don't see a solution that's going to come out that's a silver bullet, but it actually has to be a tide shift as a overall makeup of society to start saying, how do we want to start introducing affordability and what actions are we going to take as a society to work together to drive these? And what are we going to demand of our leaders, and whether municipal leaders or provincial leaders or federal leaders, to help us solve this problem?
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say is it took us 30, 40 years to get to this point. And so the journey is 30, 40-year journey out of this also, from my perspective. It's not a 1 or 2 year journey.
Yeah, it takes a lot to unwind some of that. What's your thought on some of these sort of housing innovations? It could be something like these tiny home concepts, or even what we're seeing quite significantly beginning to happen in Canada, I think also in the States, is this basically the elimination of your classic sort of R1 single family dwelling land use designation or zoning, to basically make it so that sort of increased density can happen anywhere. What are your thoughts? Sort of thumbs up, thumbs down, opportunities for any of those innovations?
So I think the tiny home concept is something that is interesting, but doesn't fundamentally, I believe, solve the need of the mass market. But with respect to the R1 zoning concept, I think that's of huge value. I think New Zealand was the one who first introduced this, where the federal government stepped over top the provincial government and the municipalities and pretty much said that every zoning the ability to protect your zoning, that only a single family house can be replaced by a single family house, would be changed with a single family house can be replaced by a multifamily dwelling, strip the rights of the NIMBY type of model, or the not in my backyard population. So I think that that's a huge component, that supply demand economics that we need to solve. And that really benefits markets that have become significantly overheated. When we look at like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, really helps those. In cities like Edmonton and Calgary, where frankly, we don't really have significant land barriers around us, the bigger challenge is, how do we create interesting things that are happening in our city that encourages our population to densify? So for example, right now I work about 8 kilometers away from my house, and it takes me 15 minutes to get to work. So the incentive for me to actually move into a high rise is limited. Now I happen to be in a high rise, that's a different story. But that seems to be, drive aisles really, really encourage people to move it. The friction that's associated with driving to work really determines whether or not they will want a high rise or high density living or low density living.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a thing that we have to work through. Personally, I believe that we have to start thinking about investment into generational technology, trying to figure out how do we shift the cost structure fundamentally, and how we can improve the speed with which we deliver homes. So a perfect example of this is in the mid-rise space. BC has done a great job of trying to bring the mass timber construction methodology out. And I know Alberta has been working hard on trying to get mass timber encouraged into this marketplace too. So mass timber, now you've got a much more environmentally friendly product and economically friendly product that replaces concrete high mid-rises as a viable solution. Mm-hmm. So that's one place that I see. But the second solution that we have to start thinking about, and Landmark is a leader in this space, where they started talking about manufacturing homes within a factory and delivering them out to site here in Edmonton. We have to start talking about how can we look at 3D printing as a potential technology improvement for us. And so we start stripping away all those costs that are associated with manufacturing in China, shipping it to Arizona, repackaging it in Arizona, sending my faucets up to a distributor through Edmonton. Why not just get the raw materials goods showing up on site, and they're getting assembled right on site, and really cutting out all those middlemen along the way of value add. So that's I think where we need to really start focusing as a society over the next 20 years to really bring that cost curve down.
Are you optimistic that some of those innovations are going to gain traction, that we'll start seeing more and more of them in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, and I'm not trying to, so 3 to 5 years, I definitely don't see it. I think our industry has a long way to go. So this is where I'll tout our horn a little bit, but we look at our product like Build Base, that we're trying to codify the IP of our business. Why that matters is because we're trying to create a platform for home builders to organize their data. And that platform allows you to start stripping away the low value add functions of like invoice checking, error checking about moving files around and so forth. It's all it is a content management system. When we look at all the technology that you and I are benefiting from, the fact that we're able to have this podcast develop over Zoom and really happen is simply because Microsoft, way back in the day, created MS-DOS, went to Windows 3.1, created a plug-and-play solution for us in Windows 95 and stabilized the platform through the years. And that stabilized platform, now you and I never worry about the blue screen of death. But we used to worry about that all the time back in the day. And so we're still in the Windows 3.1 journey as a home building industry, and we have to figure out what our platform product is going to be. And from that platform, really start making those generational leaps so that we can integrate some of these technologies to bring that efficiency from the cycle.
Yeah, that's a fascinating. I love the analogy there, the blue screen of death. I remember that many times, lost lots of files based on on that reality. Rohit, let's close on the future. I'd love to get your take. You've been part of the task force for Define the Decade. Maybe share with us what did you find fascinating about that experience being on the task force? What was there anything that you found surprising about Alberta, its past, its now, and its future? And what are some key things that excite you about where Define the Decade is pointing the province?
So loaded questions here. I'm going to come back hard at you, Adam, to remind me what I forget. The Define the Decade experience has been one of my most positive experiences I've been involved in my working career, because everybody at the table that was part of the committee that was drafting and helping collect and providing the advisory services came from a place of not self-interest, but an interest to see how we can contribute back to the province and how we can ensure that the 4.5 million people that live here today and the next 100 million people that will live in this province over the next 100 years, how will they feel? How can we make sure that we set the right platform for them going forward? And what was really interesting for me, as much as all of us struggled from the downturn that oil generated in 2014 and some of the challenges it created for the provincial government, whether it was the people that were in the room, whether it was the people that were being interviewed in one of the largest focus groups we've ever seen in the province, everybody still believed in a brighter future in Alberta. And as challenging it was, we still had this fight, this energy, which brought my father here originally, which brought him back a second time around as a born-again immigrant, and actually brought stickiness to me and my family, is that there's a ton of entrepreneurial energy. And that energy is not just within Calgary or Towers. It's not just in the Edmonton real estate industry, but it's actually ubiquitous across the province. And the task force, what they heard and what I heard was people were trying to figure out not only just accrete value to the top 80% of the population or the top 90%, but we're trying to figure out how do we make sure that prosperity lands in 100% of the population and all of us benefit with rising standards of living. And how do we continue to create value for people as they're onboarding here? And we create the land of dreams, or the field of dreams concept that the US is supposed to be. And how do we create that field of dreams here in Alberta?
Yeah, I can recall one task force meeting. We were all together and the war in Ukraine was in its early days. And we coalesced as a team around 3 missions for Alberta. And this was prior to the war in Ukraine. And they were sustainable, healthy food, low carbon energy, and medical advancements. And I remember you said this is a Berlin Wall moment, I think is the term you used, that, we'll really recognize the world has changed. And what we're seeing in Ukraine with the impacts on global food and global energy markets, really solidified those target missions that we identified in the project. And so, I think that was a reinforcement that you underscored as we solidified the final kind of structure of the project.
No, I'll tell you this. It's really interesting still following up what's happening in the Ukraine war. And I think we're going to see a development of 2 different axes that are going to show up in the Western world and then the Eastern world. And I think a lot of us are hearing it today, but the rest of North America is going to start looking to Alberta and the Midwest of the US to try to figure out how we can sustain each other and how we can move forward. And one of the weird things I was looking at was the wheat market just recently. And I don't like the drought that's just come through the US in the early part of this harvest season is really setting up that there is going to be potential for a lot of issues for the world from a food security perspective. Yeah. And Alberta has to be a part of the solution. And we have to be part of the how do we help solve the world problem. So I think as a province and as a community, we've got to figure out how to extract more yield out of our crops as we go forward. And I'm ignoring the oil issue. The oil issue still has to continue to work itself out. The gas issue still has to work itself out. So the whole energy security. But from a provincial perspective, when we look at for Albertans, I think you're going to see a massive boom that's going to take place from an investment in agri-tech, energy tech that is just going to be driven by the commodity super cycle that we're entering into. And so I think there's going to be a lot of positive outcomes, a lot of positive opportunities. And we just got to figure out how, as a province, how do we get everybody to enjoy it, not just 90% of us.
Yeah. We'll close, Rohit, with a question. What do you hope the next decade looks like for Alberta?
For me, the next decade for Alberta is really trying to heal the divisions that unfortunately COVID has created between the rural centers, Edmonton, Calgary, specifically as a province. That's what I'm really hopeful. The prosperity cycle that we're entering into will allow us to sit back and try to work on healing some of the fractures that have occurred over the last 7-8 years through COVID specifically. And I'm not talking about left versus right. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I just want to figure out, how do I go to a great rodeo party in Wetaskiwin and just have a good time and nobody's worried about whether I'm from Edmonton or Calgary, what my stripes of voting are. And I'm hoping that people will come up to Edmonton and join the Oilers as we now that we've lost, I was hoping we'd be talking about having a Stanley Cup rodeo here, you and I, right? But next year, yeah, when we're going to we'll show the Flames how to hoist a cup. Hopefully everybody will be up here and enjoying themselves. And so that's my hope that the next decade provides, because the dollars will be here in the province. The education systems are set up and we've got the right demographic of a lot of young people. And over the next 2 or 3 years, the real estate market will provide the opportunity for immigrants from out of the country, immigrants from other provinces to come here. So we as a province or as a citizenry have to figure out how to work together with different stripes of the political stream.
I love that. I love that unity, that cohesion, the healing of some of the past difficulties. So what a great way to end, Rohit. Anything else that you want to share with our listeners before we close?
Actually, there is one thought I'd love to share with you. We have a great asset that is developing out, and it's called the Business Council of Alberta. And I'm not plugging this for you. You guys are a great asset that are trying to take a politically agnostic view towards how do we increase prosperity across the province. And it's easy to be associated with you guys. And it's easy to volunteer our time as business leaders. And we hope that there are more opportunities not to work just within the business community, but actually work on more projects like Define the Decade that actually talks about how do we improve the environment for all of us.
Well, thank you for those kind words. We're thrilled and we're so fortunate that you are part of the council, that you've given your time and energy to Define the Decade. You're a rising star and we love working with you. So thank you for those kind words, Rohit. And thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of C-Suite Unplugged, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media. So give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.